Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. It's a pleasure to be with you today. My name is Alexander Horowitz. I'm the Executive Director of New Yorkers United for Justice, NYUJ. NYUJ is a bipartisan interfaith coalition of more than a dozen local and national organizations, all working together to make common sense criminal legal reform a reality in the Empire State. Part of our mission is to fight misinformation and disinformation about the system and reforms to it. And that is why today's discussion is so very important. Last summer, during the height of the first and the second waves of the COVID-19 pandemic, cities across the country experienced an uptick in certain crime categories, specifically homicides, specifically gun homicides. Opponents of criminal justice reform leapt. They took that opportunity, they took that change in data to make bad faith arguments and to impugn common sense criminal legal reforms and blame them for this change, despite the fact that most of the reforms implemented by major cities are already proven to make communities safer. So what is going on here? And how do we push back against those types of bad faith arguments? Well, today's expert panel will help us get a little closer to the answers there. We invite you to ask questions of our panelists throughout the webinar by using the Q&A function that's part of Zoom, and time permitting, our moderator will submit those questions to the panelists towards the end of the discussion. We also invite you to visit our website at nyuj.org, where you can download our most recent publication on crime trends during the pandemic and dozens of others about topics that range from pretrial reform all the way through probation and reentry. It's now my pleasure to introduce your moderator for this afternoon, Khalil Cumberbatch. Khalil is a nationally recognized advocate for criminal legal reform. After receiving his own gubernatorial pardon, he's dedicated his life and his work to this cause. He helped to found NYUJ as its chief strategist and is now a senior advisor to the coalition. He's also the director of strategic partnerships at the Council on Criminal Justice. It's a pleasure to welcome him and our outstanding panelists. Khalil?
Thank you, Alexander, and thank you to the NYUJ team for pulling together such a powerful panel to speak on an issue that is plaguing New York City and other cities across the country. I do know that we want to maximize our time today in terms of Q&A with the attendees. So please, I'm going to make a second plea to you to use the Q&A function during our conversation, because we would like to engage with you during the panel. I'm going to turn over to our panelists to do brief introductions before we delve into a series of questions that we have for them. First off is Thomas Sept.
Thank you, Khalil. Thank you, Alexander. Thank you, New Yorkers United for Justice, and everyone who's participating. My name is Thomas Sept. I'm a senior fellow over at the Council on Criminal Justice, along with Khalil, where I chair the Violent Crime Working Group. I've been working in and around criminal justice for my entire professional life, and I'm the author of a book called Bleeding Out: The Devastating Consequences of Urban Violence and a Bold New Plan for Peace in the Streets. I'm also the former Deputy Secretary for Public Safety here in New York State. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Great, thank you. Ames, you're up next.
Hi, thank you as well. I'm Ames Grawert. Just a quick background on me. I'm a senior counsel at the Brennan Center, where I work on some of our research on policies that will end mass incarceration and break the connection between mass incarceration and poverty. We have a report out last year showing that time in prison and even being convicted of a relatively minor offense can have serious and long-ranging consequences for someone's economic stability and ability to earn a living wage. And I think that economic perspective, I think, really matters to some of our conversations about crime today. I really appreciate the opportunity to be part of this distinguished panel. I hope to do justice by my co-panelists, and I'm really excited to be here.
Julian?
Thanks, Khalil. Hello, everyone. My name is Jullian Harris-Calvin. My pronouns are she and her, and I am the program director of the Greater Justice New York program at the Vera Institute of Justice, where we focus on criminal justice reform and criminal justice issues generally across New York State, and try to bridge the gap between data and policy and advocacy. I started my career as a public defender, first in DC Superior Court for several years, and then here in New York at the federal defender. So I was in federal court here in New York. And I'm excited to be here. I really look forward to the conversation. So thanks all for inviting me and having me.
And Chico.
Thank you, everyone. My name is Dr. Chico Tillmon, and I'm a senior research fellow at the University of Chicago Crime and Education Lab, but also a board member and on the leadership team of Fund Peace, an initiative to give $5.3 billion to Black and Brown communities that's vulnerable and been heavily impacted by violence. In addition to that, I'm an individual that's been system impacted. I served 16 years, 3 months in prison under draconian crack sentence. And since then, I've come home to get my PhD in criminology, law, and justice. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Chico, and thank you to all of the panelists. We're going to delve right into the questions. That way we have the maximum amount of time to really delve into what it is that we're seeing in terms of trends. On that note, there's been a ton of conversation and a ton of media presence around the narrative that crime in general is rising. Can either of you or all of you talk about the types of notable crime trends that we have seen during the pandemic and what the data is actually telling us? Included in that, obviously, you can talk about some of the factors that may have contributed to the increase or the decrease in crime rates.
I'm happy to get started if that's okay.
Please.
So I really love that both you and Alexander really hit on the narrative around bail reform and crime trends that really began around passage of bail reform, statewide bail reform in New York State in 2019. And so even before bail reform became effective, we heard this narrative that people are getting released into the streets and causing all kinds of havoc and raping and murdering everyone they came across. And in addition to your report, Forward.us put out a really interesting report where they dove into media's negligence around just taking on that fear mongering and that oftentimes law enforcement rhetoric and misinformation that really fueled what you and Alexander have talked about briefly. And the truth is that crime rates are actually at all-time lows across the country, but particularly in New York State and New York City. But it is true that as of last year during the pandemic, shootings and homicides were up. And so that is a trend, one of the trends that we saw in 2020. And even this year, shootings are still up a little bit above last year, but murders have gone down about 4%. So we are seeing that a little bit as the pandemic and its effects are waning. Some of that, those two categories of crimes, thank you for dropping in the forward research in the chat. But we're seeing as the pandemic is waning to some degree in terms of its consequences, that we are still remaining on par with 2019's historic lows. We're at 30-year lows in terms of homicides. We're at 30-year lows in terms of misdemeanors and felonies across the board. And so that is one of the trends is, crime continues to be below what it was, just a decade ago or even 5 years ago, but shootings and homicides are up. So another trend that we see though, is that as crime has dropped over the last 30 years, our jail population has simultaneously decreased. And some of that decrease happened most dramatically after bail reform. And so it's important to note that there is not some inverse relationship between, jail populations or arrests and crime rates. And so that is another trend that actually they're both going down at the same time. They were both continuing to go down at the same time in 2020. And sadly, because some of that fear mongering and rhetoric that you guys mentioned, we're seeing our jail populations across the state tick back up after the initial bail reform, decarceration, and the initial efforts to stem the risk of COVID in jails. That also helped with decarceration. So that's a trend that we're actually seeing reverse. And it's very problematic. And we think a lot of that has to do with that rhetoric, the fear mongering, and the media negligence around it. There are a couple other trends, but I'm happy to pass it on to my colleagues who also have a lot of that data. But I just wanted to point those two things out.
Thank you, Julian. Ames?
Yeah, this what you were saying reminded me of an old joke that I think I'm just going to steal from XKCD, the webcomic that y'all might know. It goes, I think it's like, I used to think that correlation implied causation, and then I took a statistics class, and the character 2 says, oh, so the class worked, and character 1 says, well, I don't know, there's no way to tell for sure. So an important thing to remember when we're doing work and talking about crime trends is exactly like Jullian was saying. You'll see lots of correlations in the data, but the tough question is whether those correlations are causal. And teasing out whether declining jail population alongside increasing crime means declining jail caused increasing crime is really, really hard and can lead you into a lot of pitfalls. Something that sticks in my mind in this conversation is, I think it was last July, NYPD made the fairly bold claim that public safety related decarceration from Rikers had led to an increase in crime, and that bail reform had led to an increase in crime. And then the New York Post, who's not a favorable outlet to criminal justice reform at all times, said, well, NYPD, can we see the data? NYPD gave them the data, and it didn't back it up at all. People who'd been released from public safety related decarceration and bail were very rarely involved in any of the shootings. And the spike in shootings is very real. The spike in homicides is very real. I don't want to minimize those at all. Those are serious, and we'll call for some really important solutions. But laying them at the foot of criminal justice reform policies just doesn't really align with the data. And so I'm really glad we're leading with that right off the bat. I think I'll leave it there, but I know we're going to have a lot more conversations about this. It's really interesting to talk about how different offense trends have diverged. Like the murder spike is very real, the shooting spike is very real, but yes, that coexist at the same time with what we saw in 2020. We saw some offenses continue a sort of downward trend, like assaults were relatively down, although I believe they're a bit up this year now. And larcenies were down as well. So we're not talking about like a uniform crime wave. We're talking about discrete trends that have discrete causes to them. We can pull those apart as we talk further.
Thanks, Ames. Thomas, I want to call on you to just say a little bit more about the particular types of charges that we've seen go up and the ones that we've seen go down. I know that there's been a ton of narrative, again, about the overall rise in crime, but the reality is that while we see certain charges spike, we're also seeing many others go down.
Sure, and thanks for the question. So I think, I would just second what, Julian and Ames has said. There is no national crime wave. The Counsel, first through the National Commission on COVID-19 and Criminal Justice that I directed, and now through the Violent Crime Working Group, which I chair, and Chico is one of our esteemed members. We've been following this very closely, issuing report after report on this. And the facts is that property crime is down significantly, with the exception of motor vehicle theft, and drug crime is down significantly. I think and so there is no sort of broad-based crime wave, but I think it's really important not to underplay and not to look away from the massive increase in community gun violence, most notably in homicides, but also in gun assaults. And it's really important to do this because this directly impacts the people who are simultaneously most burdened by the criminal justice system. This is disproportionately impacting poor communities of color. So we saw a historic 30% increase in homicide in 2020 as compared to 2019. And this year, for the first 6 months, we're up about 16%. So this is deeply, deeply disturbing. However, as the other speakers talked about, and I hope that we'll get into more of the weeds here, I don't think there's any clear connection between either the releases that occurred during the pandemic or the reforms that have been talking about. And I'll just briefly share my screen. I want to show something here. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So right here we have the year-to-date changes in homicide, and as you can see, this is for this year, first 6 months of this year, and you see an average of 16.4%. But what you can see is the vast majority of cities are experiencing this, and so a very just common sense comparison is to say, well, are all these cities the cities that are implementing criminal justice reforms? And the answer is clearly no. There's no clear connection across the country for what is a national effect between what one city that might implement criminal justice reforms like bail reform and others that don't. And so I think that there is something happening here, and thankfully there are evidence-informed solutions that Chico and others have pioneered. But I think it's a mistake to sort of lay this admittedly very disturbing trend at sort of the foot of progressive reform.
Thank you, Thomas. Dr. Chico, I want to turn it to you. If you could also talk a little bit about your interactions over the course of the pandemic with people in, as Thomas said, in the same communities who are being negatively impacted, not only by this narrative, but also by the real truth that gun violence is something that they witness on a regular basis. So if you can say a little bit more about lessons or engagements that you've had with community members.
I think where I would like to start at is prior to the pandemic and the social unrest that was started with the George Floyd incident, violence and crime was going down. It was going down at a historic rate. And I think we can't negate the impact of the pandemic along with the social unrest, which caused, in particularly in vulnerable communities, chaos. It caused a state of hysteria, uncertainty, but also it revealed the real lack of access to systems that would mitigate the social determinants of health. So it really exposed their lack of access to healthy foods, to medicine. And even when we go through this problem now, so it exposed also the scarcity in these particular communities. And all of these multiple traumas contributed to what? Hopelessness and what? A rise and violence. So I believe it's a combination of things, like a perfect storm, that caused it, more so than particular behaviors based upon reform. I think if you don't look at what the entire world was going through, then we're kind of like kidding ourselves. I think we have to look at the content, even in our communities. What happened during those times, if you think about it, most people start working how? Remote. So what it even did, the people that had access or had the ability or transportation to get to necessary services no longer were able to. And also what you see in these vulnerable communities is substance use disorder is particularly high. Now these individuals can't get the counseling sessions. They can't get that one-on-one service. They can't get that mentorship. And also a lot of people lost jobs. So that even made it more complex. So when you think at all the variables that took place during this time simultaneously, you can see why there was a rise in violence. And I think right now, what you see is us trying to wrap our brain or wrap our minds around how to mitigate not only the violence, but all these different needs in our most vulnerable communities to get things under wraps. And what you see when you go into these communities is people in a state of scarcity, in a state of hopelessness, trying to figure out how to survive literally in this present condition. And what we've been doing is trying to engage individuals despite all the obstacles that are in place. Because if you think about it, right when we thought we had a grip on it, when we got the vaccine, then came the Delta virus. So it's been one thing after another that's kind of crippled these vulnerable communities that already had a plethora of challenges.
Thank you, Dr. Chico. Before we delve into the community violence piece of it, because I think that is an important piece that we all need to have specific questions for, I do want to talk about data very briefly, because we say that a lot. We say that the data and the research, and that this particular entity, Ames, I think you said the New York Post asked the NYPD for specific data. But we all know that access to data and crunching the data and then having palatable data, what I call palatable data, are three completely different things. We can just say a little bit about why data sometimes is rare and scarce. We look at some of the reports that were mentioned during the opening remarks and by some of you, but even those reports don't have access to data from something like 100 cities. It'll say 36 cities or 21 cities. And I think it's important for the folks in the audience to understand some of the struggles that come with data, particularly accessing data. So not really a specifically pointed question, but can we say something about the importance of having access to data on a consistent level? And what are some of the strategies that we could use to push those law enforcement entities to be more transparent with data?
Sure. This could probably trigger an angry rant from any one of us about this subject. But the fact of the matter is, we just don't have on far too many important questions. We have far too little reliable data. The criminal justice system right now is in the midst of transitioning in a very awkward sort of ad hoc way from a outdated UCR system to a slightly less outdated NIBRS system. And the fact of the matter is that if we had better information, we would be able to better understand these trends. I think it's important to understand that, data, evidence, and science is always imperfect, but it's still our best means of sort of understanding these issues. But it's really important not to sometimes sort of oversell the benefit. I think one of the clearest examples of this is recently the Bureau of Justice Statistics released its latest report on hate crimes. And there was many articles written about hate crimes, whether they were up, whether they were down. What wasn't noted is that the data set is so woefully incomplete and so inconsistently reported that it's basically unusable. And so it arguably shouldn't even be put out in the first place. That's not the case with crime numbers, but it is important to keep the limitations of data in mind, and also to be constantly pushing for better information. We just can't be smarter without better information.
I just want to underscore everything Thomas said. This is something that definitely could lead to an angry rant from me. I want to channel a criticism that's been made by Fordham Law professor John Pfaff. He's made this point a million times, but I think it's really brilliant. We wait with bated breath for economic data, like at the end of every month, at the end of every quarter. And markets move on it, and we form policy based on it, reacting in real time to what's happening to the economic structure of the country. On the other hand, for crime data, we are still waiting for final national crime data from 2020. That data should probably come out in 6 days, maybe, we think. It's unacceptable to have to wait that long for real-time data to react to. As Thomas said, that's in the process of changing, where with the switch to the incident-based reporting system, we'll have rolling data at a little better frequencies, but the transition's been really rocky. Not nearly enough jurisdictions report through this new system, so We were actually due to get a tranche of data last week on like Q2 2021, I think, and roughly 40% of jurisdictions reported. So that's not anywhere near the sort of national picture we need for it. So the data architecture is arguably going to get worse before it gets better with this transition, which is really frustrating. Into the gap, however, and I should note that this extends to other forms of criminal justice data. Like, we don't have official totals from the federal government on how many people were in prison last year, like the annual prisons in 2020, annual prisons in X year survey that the Bureau of Justice Statistics puts out hasn't come out yet. Into these gaps ride fearless nonprofits like the Counsel on Criminal Justice and the Vera Institute, who provide just vital research, doing the best they can with the data that's available to show us how these trends are moving in something closer to real time. That's such incredibly important work, and I'm grateful for the work y'all do on that. But we should be able to have more real-time data so we can react to policy in something resembling real time. One day we'll get better at it, but not anytime soon.
I agree with both Thomas and Ames. And also, we do a lot of work in my program, but in other programs at Vera that are focused on county-specific data. And though jail populations and just incarceration populations in big cities are going down, we're seeing more economies around jailing and prisons and rural areas across the country, but in New York State. And we often have to do, freedom of information law requests to get very basic data, and it's within the power of the sheriff's office to deny our request or make us jump through 10 million hoops. And, we get paid to do that, and we have all the time in the world to do that at Vera. But going back to your point, Khalil, it's just not accessible to folks who are on the ground and trying to do that work. And as Ames says, we try our best to create data visualizations and code scrapers to pull information from public sources. But we don't see governments, to your point, Khalil, really interested in giving just full access to the data that's available. And when they do, we're seeing more and more bills around data and data transparency, but we're not seeing a lot of governments fund that work. I mean, it takes a lot, even internally on the government side, and personnel to do that work. And often we're calling a sheriff's office, and there's one person who does the data, and he's on, parental leave, and the new guy doesn't know what he's doing, and they don't have money for, so I'm kind of now going on the rant that you guys are talking about, but there are just so many problems with it. And a lot of it has to do with funding as well. So the funding needs to catch up to the desire of some electeds to kind of push through the legislation around it.
I want to jump in and talk about one of the challenges we have at the lab is the consistency of the way data is captured from city to city, state to state, and county to county. Some police departments don't even capture certain type of data. So you come in and you're looking for it, and they don't even track that. And one of the things we were talking about is maybe spaces like the Counsel on Criminal Justice could create this guide on what police stations should be capturing, so that there can be continuity, so that we can begin to look at the data through a clearer lens and be able to make recommendation modifications or whatever to crime that's happened, not only on a local level, but on a national level. But when there's an inconsistency of the way it's being tracked throughout the United States, it's hard to say what you should do broadly, because it's so different the way they capture the data and the way they track it. And in some spaces, it's so archaic that some of them are still, for some of the data, they're tracking it with paper, writing things down. So you're like, it can be really problematic when you're trying to do something on a national level or create national policy.
Thank you. I want to shift really briefly to the proactive steps that we can all take as a community, not only amongst criminal justice reform, social justice advocates, but also the community at large. We know that this is a all hands on deck type situation, but how do we begin to adequately have the depth of conversations that are needed without feeding into a narrative that already exists. And quite honestly, how do we do it in a way that doesn't sensationalize the narrative that already exists or misrepresents what's really happening on the ground?
I think that's, I'll just start with a very quick comment first. I think that's the hardest question to answer in this space because it's very difficult to thread the needle between acknowledging that what's happening is real. Like there was a very real increase in homicides and shootings last year. People in communities we care about deeply have noticed it. They're not going to not notice it. And if we care about those communities, and we do, we need to come up with solutions to address it. But at the same time, it's so difficult to navigate between the skill of ignoring it and the care of this of sensationalizing it. I think one powerful frame that I've been thinking about is, some of our critics some of the critics who criticize criminal justice reform movements act like we're living in a world where we've succeeded beyond our wildest dreams. Mass incarceration is a thing of the past. Criminal justice reform is the prevailing norm around the country in every jurisdiction from sea to shining sea. So anything that happened last year is a failure of the post-reform world. And that's just not the case. We're still living in the world of mass incarceration. We're still living in a world characterized by the injustices all of us work to undo every day. So it's important to conceptualize what's happened in 2020 and what's happening in 2021 as a failure of the status quo we're working against. That means that some of our solutions are going to have to be about building a new way to think about public safety. And that is a really tough conversation. I sort of defer to Dr. Chico and the others on this call on what those solutions look like. But I think it's a powerful frame is to look at this as needing to build a new paradigm and get away from what really hasn't been working for our communities.
I guess I'll just jump in. I think one thing that we have to be careful about is sort of falling into this false narrative of a binary choice between safety and justice. That you either have to choose sort of the status quo and an enhanced safety, or maybe even tougher than the status quo, or you can pursue reforms and that will involve a risk to safety. I think that's simply not the case. I think, especially in the long term, enhanced public safety depends on reforming the system and improving its fairness and legitimacy. But I think that we also need to be mindful that we are in a period where we're seeing disturbing increases in violence. And we can't talk around that. And we have to acknowledge that. And we have to acknowledge its importance and that it demands an urgent response, not just a response to the root causes of poverty, inequality, and lack of opportunity. But the good news, and this is something that really sort of frustrates me, is that there's an irony here, which is that most of the leading anti-violence strategies inside law enforcement and outside law enforcement have been pioneered by progressives, yet we don't talk about them enough and we don't celebrate them enough. The pioneers who created gang intervention and street outreach, they were all progressives. The leaders who created focused deterrence, these partnerships between police and communities, they were also progressives. So I feel like we're not embracing this enough. And I think we really do have to credit Chico and his colleagues at Fund Peace. There really is potentially a breakthrough moment here where Fund Peace may have actually, really gotten the ear of the White House and President Biden and the Domestic Policy Council. And so we could be on the verge of a historic investment in public safety, in violence reduction, that is not just about more cops, more courts, more prisons.
Thank you so much for that, Thomas. One of the things I think we have to take notice too, violence or crime is everybody's in the community problem. When you think about when crime prevails or persists, it's typically in a community that lacks guardianship. It lacks community support, where community really, when they see something about to take place or in the midst of taking place, they have these relationships with law enforcement and they're able to humanize people. They call the police because they have a relationship with them, some inside when they're on duty and when they're off duty, because typically in smaller, close-knit communities, police live in the community. I think what we got to do is humanize things and leverage the ecosystem to combat violence, what we can't do. And this is the problem conservatives do. They say, if we give you the money, then the onus is on you to stop it all by yourself. And that's just unreasonable. I don't care how much money they invest in violence prevention strategies, you can't shift the total weight on a small organization to stop a problem that's in the entire community. It must be a shared responsibility between public safety and public health, and they work collaboratively together to bring down the violence. And that's when we're going to see results. And if you think about the 90s, when it was the big war on crime, what? All that happened is crime persists or violence persists, and what? The prison swelled. So we know that we can't arrest our way out of it or fill up prisons as a way of out of. We must address the needs of the people. And one of the things that we did, the reason why I'm optimistic, is the mindset we had in America toward opioids. We made a shift and we began to see a decline in usage and the way we serve people. And we begin to see people's lives turn around because we've seen it as a sickness, or we identified the problem, we invested in it, and we begin to see changes in it.
Julian.
Yes, and amen to that, Dr. Chico. But also, I think what we're up against, Khalil, is that we, as humans who are suffering from violence and crime or shootings in our neighborhood, we all want an immediate response. And it feels like if you come and pluck this person out of here, he can't shoot me or shoot at my son or, do whatever again. And so it feels like an immediate response. It feels like I'm making myself safer. And in the short term, you might be getting safer from that particular harm. And so I think framing these public health solutions that my co-panelist just mentioned, excuse me, in terms that are immediately helpful is important. And they don't sound like this wishy-washy, like progressive utopia that we're going to get to in 30 years, right? And I think the data does show that there are immediate public safety benefits to these public health responses. When you have, violence intervention specialists go into the hospital after someone's been shot and work with that person immediately, studies show that response with that one person after he or she is shot reduces the, what's the actual language? I want to say it correctly so Thomas and Ames don't come after me, but it leads to 3 fewer retaliatory shootings. And that one response after that one shooting. And so it's important that we tell people that that's happening. We see programs, and like Dr. Chico said, it shouldn't be up to these nonprofit programs on shoestring, budgets, but we see programs like the Advanced Peace Program in Richmond, where there's an 85% reduction in firearm assaults and a 65% reduction in related homicides within just a year or two. So there are immediate benefits and immediate safety for the people in that community that I don't think is articulated well in the way that we frame these things. And it just sounds like elitist, progressive, utopian ideas.
Can I just
Thank
jump
you.
in on
go ahead.
just on this? I also think, just to reinforce what Chico said, this is a collective problem. We can't put it all on these violence intervention organizations, even though there is promising evidence about what they can do. And I think we have to be honest and be accountable and, really think about some moderation here in terms of amongst us progressives. Everything we know in terms of the science of violence reduction is that you need both rewards to improve behavior and punishments. We can't be we can always object to mass incarceration, but targeted incarceration of the highest risk individuals for an appropriate amount of time is something we all got to get comfortable with if you want to reduce homicide. And we just don't live in this utopia, as Julian said, where incarceration, where police, where prosecutors and courts are a thing of the past. And so I worry sometimes that some of the enthusiasm for sort of outright abolition is actually weakening the systems that we need to serve these people. And so I hope that we can also not just criticize the system, but advocate for its improvement so that it better serves the people that we're trying to serve.
Can I throw out a related point, just something I've been thinking about? There's really good data on how many homicides go unsolved in this country. Like clearance rates for police departments in big cities range from the teens in Chicago in some years, which is shocking. That means like 83% of homicides go unsolved, depending on what time window you're assessing the clearance rate across. That's a whole other story. Or like the 40 to 50%, which still means that to get away with murder, which is like supposed to be the impossible, is actually the reality in many places. I've been trying to think through solutions that might be a way to show that police are more responsive to crimes like homicide and are able to solve them and prevent them. And I don't have a great idea of it. I know there's been some discussion about like detective hiring, detective training. Meta Glacius wrote a piece on it a couple of weeks ago, I think, that I thought was interesting in some parts. But I wonder if my co-panelists have any thoughts on like the relationship between clearance rates, crime, solutions that address the low clearance rates we see in these cities, because that can be a real driver of police distrust, and that can be a real driver of retributive violence as well.
I think that's exactly correct. When you're in a neighborhood where police are just being fanned out in neighborhoods, but the homicides are not being solved, but you're jumping out on all the Black and brown kids and frisking them and trying to find guns or whatever. And so it does lead to, I think, distrust in those communities where we feel like you're just here to oppress us. You're not here to keep us safe. You're not here to solve these homicides or these very, very serious crimes. And instead, I think, as you're saying, Ames, we could build trust within communities that are over-policed, over-incarcerated, under-resourced, and under-supported by really thinking about how we budget for policing and what policing should be doing. Should it be targeted policing, not in the proper noun sense, but should we be spending more money on training and hiring detectives and professionals to go in and solve those serious crimes that take lives or ruin lives in a way that we think are more serious, and then take the rest of that money, right, that is wasted on just fanning out and having what in DC they call jump outs, right? Take that money and invest it in the kinds of solutions that Dr. Chico was talking about, right? So there's not any one way, but I think if communities see that we are concerned about their lives and their children that are being shot at or killed, but also aren't just there to like hook them and book them, right? We're actually in there to like invest in their communities and provide the supports to also prevent crime or stop it before it happens, and really invest in the people who are at risk of being involved on either side of those crimes, because usually one victim is another person's perpetrator. That stats show. Then I think we can bridge that divide that you're talking about.
Thank you. I want to just shift the conversation a little bit to resources. I know we've mentioned that quite a few times. And it's kind of two prongs that we're going to touch on. The first one is, there is a existing narrative, so to speak, that the calls to defund law enforcement entities across the country have led to the spike in crime, but specifically the spike in gun violence. Panelists, can you weigh in on that?
Sure, I'll weigh in. Just again, the calls to, there were widespread calls to defund police departments immediately after the brutal murder of George Floyd, but those calls didn't actually translate into that many actual reductions in police budgets across the country. It's actually isolated to a few cities. And again, going back to the point about crime trends, if the police have been defunded or partially defunded in only a few cities, but we're seeing this massive trend across many, many cities of increased violence, then you can't really attribute that to calls to defund. I will say this, there is significant evidence of reduced police, discretionary police activity. Stops, searches, arrests, and things like that immediately after, the social unrest. And there is evidence, there is some reason to believe that that's part of what may be driving homicides up. And so I think we do have to realize that in the most dangerous places with the most dangerous people, we do need some form of proactive policing, and there needs to be an authorizing environment to do that. However, I think we absolutely have to be mindful of what Julian said, which is, how do you make sure that the police are fishing with a fishing pole and not with a net, and that this isn't just broad-based jump out squads. I think that's a really important issue because, in authorizing limited proactive policing, we can't authorize proactive policing and zero tolerance policing across the board. But I think it's very hard to. I think there is an environment right now where proactive policing is very difficult to do, and I think that's having an impact.
Could I jump in real quick? I think when we have this conversation, sometimes it's a little bit difficult because of the complexity. Without the conversation around defund the police, there would have been no advancement. Let's just start there. And let's start, why did people start saying defund the police? It wasn't because of one George Floyd isolated incident. It was because of Breonna Taylor. It was because of George Floyd. It was because of Rashad. It was because in some cases, it was blatant that a situation was handled wrong and the system of policing wouldn't come forth and just say that isolated incident is absolutely wrong. We don't train like that. Instead, this fraternal, let's just think about it. This fraternal or society or group or brotherhood of policing justified the actions of each individual, and us as citizens would not have been treated the same in the same situation. It's two different standards. Hypothetically, if one of us shot somebody, it was on camera, we're going to get arrested. It's not going to be we're going to investigate. They're going to still keep their job. We're going to get arrested immediately. And the thing was, throughout the country, nobody from the police association stepped forward and said, hey, you know what, that's wrong. Hey, this is not how we train. We don't know. We did, in those situations, they didn't act as if it was an isolated incident. So now the conversation saying, if everyone is in support of these actions, then it needs to be defunded or reformed. And if you think about it, if you see a travesty, and then you have to look at the role media play. So it's playing in people's psyche. It was on the news 24/7. And it was, and this is what was so incredible. Right after George Floyd, it'll be another incident. And you was like, what the hell is going on? You would think with everything going on that in particular police departments across the country, they'll say, hey, take it, let's be a little bit precautious in situations like this. Let's think, we trying to slow this thing. But it was happening event after an event. So that's where the cry came from, defund the police. Now, so if we look at it in that context, we can understand why people in vulnerable communities, who it was happening to. Let's look at that too. All of these individuals were Black individuals. So the hostility was, if you kill a Black life, it's not valued. Because when people were being killed, and it's shown on TV that they're obviously wrong, there was no reprimand from government or from institutions. So that as a system has to change. And when I think if we can have real dialogue with police and they could say, hey, you know what? That was wrong. That was wrong. You could say, okay, one thing I like about sports, this is where this is a good analogy. When an NBA or NFL or one baseball player say something against a particular population, immediately the team comes out and say, hey, that's an individual's behavior. We don't condone it. And you know, and the sport isn't damaged. That has to happen in policing. It has to be some swift action taken, or else you're going to create what we had all over the country. And I think when you look at it in that context, you could say, okay, I see why they were saying defund the police. They saying this system is broke where an individual is murdered on TV and no one is saying anything. You know, no one. And what I mean is it wasn't about black or white. No one from the police department is saying it. So it gave almost an inference like police violence is okay. It's justifiable.
Thank you, Dr. Chico. If we could just stay on resources, but talk a little bit about the Biden administration's very significant pledge to help to get very much needed resources to some of the programs and efforts that are happening on the ground. Obviously, you know, I think communities across the country welcome that support and that help. But there are real concerns that the money will actually get to the effective programs that are doing the effective work. Would love to hear from either of you or all of you about some concerns or some steps that you can suggest happen in order for these resources to get to the places that need it the most.
I mean, I'll go first. Look, I think when you're scaling up, an investment from the tens of millions into the billions, there are valid concerns about waste, fraud, lack of efficacy, all of those things. All of those concerns exist in all of our public safety investments. They exist for policing, for courts, for prisons, and they all waste money as well. And what we have is an area that is chronically underfunded, the community-based side of the criminal justice equation. It really, I think for the first time, our National Commission on COVID-19 and Criminal Justice, when we talked about the system, we talked about the system not as 3 sectors, but as 4 sectors. Obviously the cops, obviously the courts, obviously corrections, but also communities and community-based organizations. And so, look, I think that those concerns are valid. We're going to need to address them. We're going to need to insist on, evidence of effectiveness, but that's not an argument for not moving forward. We desperately need these approaches. We need a much more balanced approach. I've made the argument that policing and the other parts of the criminal justice system are still very much necessary to reduce crime and violence, but those investments have been made. We now need to really scale up those community-based investments as well.
I would just say that, I think a lot of folks are concerned about those other kinds of public safety funding solutions being funneled through the police department or DA's offices, and giving the DA's offices and the police department the power of the purse around this, but also, being too involved in the actual interactions and the services that are being provided to folks. And, the idea is to keep people from having to have contact and interactions with police, courts, and district attorneys. And so that certainly isn't what I believe. Communities want to have to continue to talk to police and DAs and courts to get the services, the supports that they need. It just feels like they're further being criminalized. And so the concern that many of us have is that this funding, all of this lovely funding that we all agree needs to be channeled into our city coffers, that needs to be managed outside of existing law enforcement structures?
It's a couple of challenges. I've been going all over the country and talking to grassroots organizations in several cities. Here's some of the challenges. One of the huge challenges is going to be actually being awarded the grant, because a federal grant has certain metrics you have to hit, certain criteria that a lot of small-based community organizations don't have the infrastructure or capacity to even have a grant writer. It's 7 people who maybe lost their child that's doing work in the community, working on a shoestring budget from volunteers throughout the community. They don't have a grant writer. They don't have a software to track their to track the data that's going on, or how many people. So we have to construct these grants in a way where we establish not only intermediaries, but fiscal agents with wraparound services to make sure it gets to the ground. Or what's going to happen is all of the larger organizations that don't have cultural competency, don't have cultural sensitivity, are going to get the grants and aren't going to reach the people in the community. You need some of the work need to be led by black and brown people on the ground that know the people at the highest risk, to cut that time limit that it would take to identify them, because some of the impact has to be immediate. There's going to be immediate impact if you engage the right people, because some of the people want to change, and with the right opportunities, they're going to change. It's the other maybe 7 out of 10 that you're going to have to work hard on it, but some of the people just don't have an opportunity, and that's one of the things we're going to be able to provide to them. But my feeling is that accessibility from large organizations who might have the infrastructure but not the access to the people, if they get the money, what's going to happen is they're going to say the 5.3 billion failed. And we have to come up with strategies to make sure that the money actually reaches the ground with people serving the people that's actually impacted.
Thank you. I want to be mindful of the time. We've been engaged thoroughly in conversation for the past 40 or 50 minutes or so. This webinar will end at 1:15. And so I want to just transition just to try to start answering some of the questions that have come in through the Q&A. First question from Christopher Watler. Good to see you, Christopher. Thanks for joining. Can the panel speak a little bit more about community-based solutions that include obviously community-based organizations that we have growing evidence on and are scalable to address violence and strengthen communities?
Sure, I'll start. I think a number of us can answer this, but I would say that looking at the evidence, there's about 10 to 12, or maybe 6 to 8 sort of non-enforcement community-based strategies that over the past 30 years have shown real promise or actually have shown real effectiveness. So one is various forms of street outreach. Using people with credibility in the community, sometimes former offenders, sometimes not, to engage those at the highest risk of violence and either connect them to services, mediate conflicts, or both. That's an area, I think the evidence is promising in that area. I think basically what the evidence says is if you do it right, it can have a big impact. And if you don't do it right, it doesn't. And so, we're going to need increased resources there to ensure that we do it right. I think another area is the whole sort of area of environmental crime prevention. Yes, we need police in the highest violence areas, but we also need to invest in those areas. And one of the things that we're seeing is that very targeted place-based investments in cleaning and greening, in rehabbing abandoned buildings and dilapidated parks, and improving streetlight, restoring city services. All of those things, when highly targeted, can make an impact on violence as well. And then, we have to embrace, the individuals are at the highest risk for violence, as Julian said, who are both, who are sometimes perpetrators, often victims, almost always victims first. We have to embrace them with empathy and offer them a real way to change their lives. And in my view, the most evidence-based way to do that is with high quality cognitive behavioral therapy that helps them identify. I think one of the things that you have to understand is those at the highest risk for violence have been exposed to so much violence that they have higher rates of PTSD than returning veterans from Iraq or Afghanistan. And so you can't just say, oh, we're going to get you a job, oh, we're going to get you a GED, and expect them to turn their lives around. No, we have to treat their trauma first and address those things. So I think intensive high quality CBT is an important piece of the puzzle. There are others as well, but I think those are some of the leading ones. Focused deterrence, which is not purely community-based, but involves providing services to high-risk individuals and groups, but also insisting on accountability. It's a police-community partnership, is also extremely effective. So I'll leave it there.
I want to make sure that, I think what's most important at this point in time when we're seeing violence so high and seeing it contribute to, a discussion about criminal justice reform and how we can have fairness and safety. These short-term solutions, they're solutions that will yield results in the short term, are vitally important and have to be number one. I want to make sure we don't lose sight of longer-term solutions as well. Like Thomas alluded to, environmental factors. The relationship between poverty and crime is famously absurdly complex. Books are written about it and barely scratch the surface of the topic. But we do know that violence tends to propagate. And in fact, according to an analysis by one of my colleagues, which is very preliminary still, but really interesting, tended to surge in some of the poorest neighborhoods last year. I think if we also start to reinvest in a more broad sense in some of these communities that have been impacted by violence, we can not just have short-term solutions that are addressing the problem in the moment, but building a more stable community in the long term. I think that should be on the table too. These are all complex policy areas. That's an equally complex policy area, but I want to make sure it stays on the table as well.
Thanks, Ames. Thanks, Thomas. Another question that came in through the Q&A is from Jeffrey. Is drug crime, quote unquote, down, or is the quote unquote enforcement of drug crime down?
Given the quality of the data, how would we know?
Right.
This is part of the problem, but I'll yield to others on this.
Yeah, I think sadly, those numbers are more likely a reflection of enforcement and not of underlying reductions in substance abuse. The reason I believe that is just because we have some really disturbing numbers on the public health side about the increase in overdoses during the pandemic. So unfortunately, I think that drug use is up and overdoses. We know that overdoses are up, and so I think that the police have prioritized away from drug enforcement, which may not necessarily be a bad thing, but I don't think those numbers reflect reduced drug use.
Thank you. For folks who are asking in the Q&A, yes, all of the links, including most likely other links that were not touched on during this conversation, but relevant to the links that were mentioned, will be shared after the webinar. Another kind of housekeeping issue, if there is a specific question that was sent to a specific panelist, if we cannot get to that question before we end, we'll send that panelist that question separately, and hopefully we can get some contact information for you and send back their answer in typed form. I want to now transition to any closing remarks that each of you may have relating any of the points that we touched on today. But if you can also just talk about some next steps, where do we as a concerned community, and again, community not just for folks who are directly impacted by these issues on a daily basis, but also community at large, folks who are working really, really hard to solve some of the very complex problems that face not only those communities, but our society at large.
Could I jump in real quick? I want to just say this. Next step, I would invite everybody to reach out to their senator or senator or congressman and push for the Build Back Better bill to be passed through reconciliation with the $5.3 billion in there that'll go to these vulnerable communities that will allow us to continue to be innovative and change violence in our most vulnerable communities throughout the United States. I believe it's critical. It's a 8-year worth of funding, and it's really needed in our community. Thank you.
I mean, I can just recap some of what, at least here at Vera, we think the next steps should be, particularly in New York State, as we have this shifting political landscape upstate and downstate here in New York City. It'll be an interesting several years. But what we think the 4 solutions are as we move forward around crime and public safety is, as we mentioned before, really just address murders and gun violence, right? That is where we think the bulk of policing should go if we are serious about having the communities who are most impacted by crime and most impacted by over-policing and mass incarceration. But if we want to build that trust there and show that we actually really care, right? And so we should be focusing our policing resources on the serious crimes, closing these case closure rates, raising the case closure rates, which are abysmally low, particularly in places like New York City. And then with the other investments that we can make into public safety, instead of investing, as I said before, and Thomas and Ames mentioned, in these kind of like, wide net policing, invest in community-driven public safety. And as we mentioned, there's a ton of federal funding that's come in. Though crime rates have gone down, policing budgets have gone up. Some of that money should be going towards investing in community-driven public safety, like those that Dr. Chico talked about before. Continuing to work on decarceration. And here in New York City, that would be closing Rikers Island, which, as we all have probably heard in the last couple of weeks, it's an alternate universe there at the moment. And so in New York City specifically, closing Rikers Island. And then the 4th, for just all of our leaders across the state, is also to just champion criminal legal reforms as a general matter. And part of that is the data piece, right? Investing in the data so that we can see in real time how the criminal legal system reforms are being implemented and how close they are getting to achieving their stated goals. One of the problems that we're having, here at Vera, we're working on a bail reform evaluation study over the course of the 3 years post bail reform. And like we mentioned before, getting the data is really hard. And we only have data from 2020. We should have data, like Ames said, hopefully up to this month, but at very least the first couple quarters of the year. And it's hard to have, these real-time implementation, analyses, so that we can, for the next legislative session, potentially say, this is what's working, what's not, let's tweak these reforms. They really should be championing the criminal legal reforms and the tools and the funding needed to make the tweaks that are really going to affect communities and help them flourish.
Thank you. Ames?
Yeah, one thing I keep thinking about when I think about, crime in 2020, potential causes for what happened, and potential solutions, is I think it's important to have a degree of humility in the face of complex national social phenomena that sweep up so many lives. The country experienced a huge decline in crime from 1990 to 2014. People call it the Great Crime Decline. Patrick Sharkey, a sociologist, has written extensively on it. But we still don't understand maybe even half of the reason that crime declined so much. My colleagues wrote an analysis called "What Caused the Crime Decline" at the Brennan Center, and they picked out some of the potential causes, but admitted that they couldn't explain all of it. If we're still debating, what caused that huge shift in American life, the notion that we would have a clear answer about what caused violence to rise in 2020 now, it just doesn't match up. A corollary of that is I think a lot of the time we look for, short takes in the news offering, single cause or explanations for why crime is up. I implore just everyone on this call, whenever you hear a single cause explanation for rising crime, it's this or it's that, ask why someone would be phrasing that to you. That this is such a complex phenomenon that there are hundreds of interlocking causes that need to be studied. So I just want to put in a plug for complexity and thinking through these problems rather than relying on short, quick answers, which are almost never going to be the complete story. Lastly, I want to expand on what Julian is saying about the need for continued reform at the criminal justice system in New York State. The Brennan Center has some really interesting research we've been working on showing the relationship between poverty and mass incarceration. There's a difficult but extant relationship between poverty and crime and social well-being as well. There's some reforms up for debate this year that might have a strong impact on community well-being, like Clean Slate, which will give people who've been convicted of crimes a real second chance, that it will wipe their record clean after a certain point. Those are really important. So while we're talking about understanding why crime increased in 2020 and solutions to it, we should have the courage to continue working on solutions that we know as people in the reform community will lead to better, safer, healthier communities as well. I just want to thank everyone for including me in this discussion. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, Ames. Thomas?
First of all, it's been a pleasure to be on this panel with my co-panelists, Julian, Chico, and Ames, and I'm grateful to the New Yorkers United for Justice for this platform. They call it criminal justice for a reason, and the reason is because it is a system that is devoted to reducing crime in ideally a just way. If you only focus on the justice, you will not get a complete picture. If you focus only on the crime, you will not get a complete picture. And I think that we need to fully embrace this. And really, relatedly, I think there's two constituencies that we really need to be listening to especially carefully. We've talked about the need for more and better data in research and, having objective analyses of programs. And so I won't spend more time on that. The other group are impacted individuals and communities. And I want to say this, I've been doing this a long time, and I've been in conversation with impacted individuals and communities for a very long time, and have some very long-standing deep friendships and relationships and colleagueships there. And one thing I have to say is that when you are working with people who have been through, survived both the criminal justice system, crime, concentrated poverty, and all of these things, those people are often more pragmatic than the people who represent them. And they want solutions both to the injustice of the system and to the injustice of crime itself. And we as progressives, if we really care about these people, we need to provide relief on both fronts. I think we can do that, but I think we have to avoid some of the absolutism that we sometimes tend to in some of our rhetoric. And so I think that those two groups, if we center those two groups, and really if we center, most importantly, those impacted individuals and communities, I think that we are most likely to be successful.
Thank you, Thomas, Ames, Julian, and Dr. Chico for your time, especially the fact that we went over by 3 minutes. Thank you all to the participants who joined us. A special thanks to the NYUJ Coalition and the NYUJ team for pulling this all together. I just want to mention them by name. Of course, we've met Alexander, but also Jarrett, Ju Young, and a special thanks to Hannah Dershowitz, who compiled the report that really sparked the idea for this webinar. So thank you all to you. And again, let's think about this issue as a community one, not just by people who are directly impacted, but also by people who care deeply about the issues that are facing those communities. So thank you all. Oh wait, I'm sorry, Chico, did you conclude? Did you get to give? Okay, great. Yeah. Okay, I thought so. Thank you. All right, everyone. Thank you. Have a great day.